episode 4 of The Piper in the Cave. First, let me acknowledge that this is being recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded and it remains Aboriginal land. So sorry for such a gap between episode 3 and episode 4. A number of things in my life caught up with me. And yeah, all I can say is sorry, and I'm definitely going to do a bit better to try and keep things moving along at a sort of bi-weekly rotation, even if that means recording some things to have in the bank when I have a bit of time that I can then upload if I happen to find myself too busy again. Anyhow, today I wanted to talk, about this slow air, Aisling Gheal, but about slow airs in general, because the whole point of this project is really just talking about pipes, and I feel slow airs don't get talked about often enough, and when they do get talked about, they get talked about in some really unhelpful ways. So what I sort of mean here is there's all this language and ways of talking around, the slow airs are the most important part of the piping repertoire. I'm not actually going to disagree there. And that, the true test of a master piper is their ability to play slow airs. Anyone can play jigs and reels. So you get that sort of stuff really putting this repertoire on a pedestal. And at the same time, there's this kind of gatekeeping discourse that keeps people from trying to climb that pedestal. You hear these things around, there's no way to teach this, you just have to feel it, you just have to know the song. And there's a lot to be said for feeling it and knowing the song, but I think there's also a lot of value in sitting down and talking about it, which is not to de-emphasise all the deep lyrical, perhaps even spiritual qualities to this music, but I think it's actually a way of better understanding them in some ways. And for instance, it's so rare to actually encounter slow airs taught. If you look at some of the lessons available online, if you go to your average summer school, chances are you're going to spend your time learning to play jigs and reels on the pipes, which is great. And this is sort of left to this mysterious other world, and you're kind of just on your own. So I feel for you, for all of us really. Okay. That being said, if the first bit of advice is, you just have to feel it, that's terrible advice, or unhelpful advice at least. The second bit of advice you hear is actually good advice, which is you have to listen to a hell of a lot of singing, especially Shanno singing, but I think there's enough in a lot of English language songs too that you can kind of draw in some of those, or let that give you a lens into this repertoire just as, or perhaps not just as much, but in a similar way to the Shannos. And I absolutely encourage massive listening to Shanno singers. I think it's just vital to any understanding of traditional music in some ways. The last thing I want to say before I get onto this air in particular is that maybe this is just my own biases as much as anything, but sometimes I like to think there are pipers who put the tune first and pipers who put the instrument first. It's a very simplistic classification, but sometimes it helps me to think about things that way. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. I'm not going to spend any time at all classifying pipers who I know or otherwise, because I'm bound to offend someone if I do that. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we came up with our own lists of pipers who put the tune first, pipers who put the pipes first, and actually there was a lot of dissimilarity between the two. But what I want to say is, when it comes to dance music, I have a lot of time have a lot of time for pipers in both camps, and I think that's all part of the fantastic diversity of uilleann piping style and practice. I'm all for that. When it comes to slow airs, for some reason I'm much less interested in people elevating the instrument at the expense of the repertoire. Maybe that is just me, but to me there is something about the slow air tradition that actually just requires a level of respect and understanding of that tradition that cannot be substituted by a technical grasp of the instrument. Okay, this song, this air, Aisling Gheal. So it's often translated as bright vision, and that's probably not a bad translation, but it's worth noting that an Aisling is not just any vision. It's really specifically referring to this literary genre of poetry, particularly of the 18th century, I think, in which the poet would have a vision in which the spirit of Ireland would appear to them, probably to him, given that the poets, at least the poets whose words have survived to us, have mostly been male. But in any case, the spirit of Ireland would appear to the poet as a woman. And sometimes an old and wise woman, sometimes a young and beautiful woman. And she would prophesy, is perhaps the word for it. It's a prophetic vision. She would foretell a future in which Ireland was free. And because of that, this song very much falls into the young and beautiful woman category, by the way, if you happen to find a translation of the lyrics. Or you can read Gaelic, of course. But in this, in this song, there's very much this particular, quite striking contrast, or what seems to us a contrast, because it's unfamiliar, between what reads like erotic poetry and what reads like political commentary. And that's a really striking and weird thing for someone coming to this from our place and time, I think. So maybe just worth noting that that is there. And there is this complex tension of hope and desire and love expressed in this song. This is one of those songs that Sean O'Riordan had a lot to do with the popularisation of, the reason that it's widely played and to some extent widely sung today. A lot of that comes down to Sean O'Riordan. And there's also been speculation that he may have had a hand in kind of arranging it into the form we now know and think is the traditional form. I don't really have the resources to follow that up, and I'm not too bothered one way or the other, because what we have is such a stunning melody that I don't care if it's entirely from the pen of Sean O'Riordan, honestly. It's also, it is widely played on the pipes, absolutely, but it's one that's sort of entered the piping repertoire later, by which I mean we don't have recordings of Ennis, Clancy, Rowsome playing it. I think the earliest recording I've found, though it's entirely possible that's not the earliest, but it is Thomas O'Cannon, I think from the 90s. And really the one that most people are probably familiar with, and rightly so, it's extraordinary, is Liam O'Flynn from The Poet and the Piper, with organ accompaniment. Absolutely stunning. And I guess the final piping one I'll mention, just because it's interesting, is John McSherry plays it, but not in that key. He plays it in the key of G, so higher up on the chanter. And I haven't learned that version, but it's quite striking and fascinating. And worth remembering that sometimes we do have this low D fetish on the pipes, where we have to play everything in the lowest key it can sit on the chanter, so we can honk out those low Ds. But at the same time, this thing does have a range of 2 octaves. So, and often these songs are an octave and a couple of notes, so very often there can be room to try them in different keys too. Alright, and yeah, in terms of singing recordings, since I mentioned you should be listening to singers, we all should be listening to singers, Ela O'Leonard has really made this one of his hallmarks, I think. There's actually 2 recordings available, one of him singing it as a very young boy, I'm not sure quite how young, but prepubescent from the voice, and also recordings of him singing it as an adult, so that's an interesting compare and contrast exercise if you're so inclined. There's not actually as many recordings of singers singing this song as I expected, honestly. Another great one I have been listening to quite a bit is Aisling Gheal, which I only discovered in the last week or so. I'm kind of preparing for this, but really, really lovely interpretation there too. Great. So, part of the reason I suggested listening to singers, and part of the reason I wanted to play an air that is, to some extent, one that pipers have had their hands on for a shorter time, is because there are some just really interesting features of how this is sung and how it's phrased particularly that aren't quite the most natural things. You know, if you received a sheet music with all the dots on it, all the notes, but had no idea of where the phrase endings were, I think you would probably actually play it differently to how the song goes. I'll show you what I mean. Probably the big one. So this first chunk, you might call it an A section, I guess, is really 4 phrases. And I'm interested in the end of the 3rd phrase, but I'll just play it to get to there. That's a very simple version, roughly as the song is phrased. What a lot of pipers will play, and not naming any names because I don't really want to, and I'm sure I've done this myself too before I actually listen to it properly, but is the 3rd phrase. It's very tempting to make it and end that phrase on the A rather than the F sharp. Because that's a perfectly lovely melody. Why not? I'll tell you. No. It's a really odd thing to have this lovely lyrical melody and then have this A-F figure. That's because it kind of almost seems like the record skipped a beat or something. The song kind of seems to get a bit stuck. And it is entirely melodically appropriate. To play it that way, but that doesn't then match the words of the song. And I think it's entirely fine to deviate from the approach singers take, but I'd like people to at least be aware when they're doing that, rather than it just happening instinctively or because they are remembering the song in a different way. I think there's always more power in these choices if they are choices, rather than just uninterrogated practice. And so I'd also like to have the option to play it as singers will sing it. And to some extent that means treating those notes in a way that makes them make sense melodically on an instrument. So one thing I'll often do is try and colour that last F sharp, like I just did there, in a different way. So it doesn't just seem like a AF, it's actually something different rather than a repetition of 2 notes. Or you could hit a regulator, etc. Or if you're already playing a regulator, change it. Add something, you know. Because I think we need to do that for this to make sense, because we don't have dynamics on the pipes, and if you hear singers do it, they'll almost really be tailing off when they hit that F sharp. So it's all about that A, and then that's only just a kind of a faint retraction or something. But on this dynamically flat instrument, it's very hard to do that, so I think we need to find some other way to make that make melodic sense. And that's sort of what I've come up with, is a different treatment of that note. And just quickly, in the, I guess what you might call the B part, there's a similar thing where almost, I guess it's the climax of the tune in some ways. Right? That A is part of the preceding phrase, and then that is the new phrase. Again, it's melodically, it would make sense. Make that a big triumphant moment, and then play that A as a lead in to the next phrase. But again, that's not what the words do if you listen to the song, and I think there's some worth in trying to at least work out how we can make the song itself work on this, rather than immediately going for the easy or the compelling option for how we think a melody should go. Alright, couple more things I want to talk about. Oh yeah, while I'm on phrasing. So, having said that there's value in respecting the phrasing of a singer, there are actually times when singers will phrase things differently, you know, even verse to verse of the same interpretation, and it's worth listening for those things, because that can give us some really good resources for actually not being so constrained to what we think is the singing way. So I'll show you what I mean. In this first chunk there's 4 phrases, but only 2 of those seem to be universally respected by singers in the recordings I've been listening to. So that is respected, and then you go on. But you can push through here, and that one is respected, and then you can push through to the next one, and so on. So you can almost play it as a 2-phrase structure, and it's quite interesting because one of those phrases kind of overlaps the start of the repetition, if that makes sense. And I was definitely trying to play with that sort of change of momentum, change of assigning different weight to different notes and different moments in the tune as one of the strategies in how I approach this. One other thing I hear from a lot of pipers on this tune that I would question, though if you've got a good reason for it, I'm certainly not going to tell you not to, and that's this, I guess, second phrase. A lot of pipers like to make this all about an F sharp. Something I've heard less from singers, and to me I think it's important to save that F sharp for these later moments, because then when you hit the B section, again if you're calling it that, big triumphant F sharp ends that phrase. And if you've already spent so long on the F sharp before that, I think you kind of lose some of that impact of suddenly hitting a new height at what is more structurally the climax of the tune. So I like to make that really about the E, and really hint no more than that at the F sharp. But again, feel free to disagree with me, but it's always good to disagree for a reason, or at least know that you're disagreeing rather than just doing something. Last thing I wanted to talk about with this one is what I was doing with the regulators, and this is another kind of thematic thing I'm using to kind of build this interpretation, because I think it is more important to build an architecture in slow airs than it is with dance music. to me, playing dance music is like messing around with your little bricks of Lego, and you can, not demeaning that in any way, and you can kind of pop them out and replace them and make decisions on the fly. Whereas to me, slow airs, there is a narrative arc that I think is more, for me at least, is more important to respect. So a theme that I was kind of using to link my interpretation here is, well, a lot of moving between these 2 points on the regulators, the GD and the GF. And you know, of course, you can do some nice slides around there, just holding the D down. But then once you're there, you can also, I mean, it's hard to stretch, and it means a little bit less stability on the chanter, but you can take your thumb off and play some of these kind of cross chords. So like an ADF, ADF sharp that is, which is really a D major chord, or a BDF is a B minor chord, lovely one, or a BDG, G major chord. Yeah, even while you're playing with your right hand on the chanter, if you can take your thumb off, you can sort of do something. You can do all that sort of stuff. I think that's all I wanted to talk about for this, so thank you for tuning in for episode 4, and hopefully I'll see you before too long. Sneak preview for the next one. I'm planning on taking apart Patsy Tui's setting of the Monahan jig. If you've heard that cylinder recording, absolutely one of the pinnacles of recorded piping as far as I'm concerned, and I've wanted to pull this apart for a long time, so I'm looking forward to doing that. See you next time.